Hi everyone and welcome to the Winecast. It seemed to me that after talking about how 3 European countries, France, Italy, and Spain, classify their wines, it would be good to have a look at the system in place in the US. This system is based on American Viticultural Areas, or AVAs. And the first thing to take in is that an AVA is really not equivalent to an AOC, a DOC, a DO, an IGP, and any of those other designations that form part of the quality pyramids of the EU member countries. In fact, the whole concept of a quality hierarchy is pretty foreign to the American system. AVAs and these other designations do have something in common, and that's that they all stand for clearly defined geographic areas. But the major difference, and it is pretty major, is that while the European systems are more or less regulated depending on where they stand in the hierarchy, the AVA system has virtually no regulation of viticultural and winemaking practices. Managing wine appellations was first the responsibility of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and that was the body under which the AVA system was created in 1978. The responsibility for the system was later passed on to the Alcohol, Tobacco, Tax, and Trade Bureau, the TTB for short. Though the system was created in 1978, the first AVA wasn't awarded until 1980. Any guesses who was first? Wait for it. Augusta, Missouri. Yep, Augusta, Missouri. I know, everyone always guesses Napa Valley, but that was the second AVA ever awarded 8 months later in 1981. Before the AVA system, the ATF used a system based on either the state or the county from which the grapes in a wine were sourced, with allowances made for multi-state or multi-county designations for cases where grape-growing areas from which winemakers might get grapes cross state or county lines. You'll see a lot of wines identified as state or county wines today, since the state-county system was allowed to remain as a parallel system to the AVAs. But it's important to remember that states and counties are not AVAs. This can lead to some confusion. Say, for example, you saw a bottle designated as a Napa County wine. That designation doesn't mean the same thing as the designation Napa Valley does on a wine. For one thing, Napa County takes in a larger area than the Napa Valley AVA does, and if you see Napa County on a label, it probably means that some or all of the grapes the wine was made from were grown in areas outside of the Napa Valley AVA, but still within the county line. So if that's what AVAs aren't, what are they? Well, like I said earlier, they're specifically defined geographic areas, with that definition based on characteristics like climate, geology, soils, and elevation. Essentially, the AVAs are a nod or a hat tip to the concept of terroir, the French notion that the place where grapes for wine are grown will impart something of itself to the finished wine, and the main idea behind AVAs is that it's worth singling out certain areas for their climate, soil, geography, and such, because these aspects of the area will contribute a uniqueness to the grapes grown there, and by extension to the wines made from them. Anyone, including a private citizen without any connection to the wine industry, can propose an AVA and the TTB will review the proposal. By mid-2016, there were at least 236 AVAs in the U.S., with 138 of those in California. The largest of these, the Upper Mississippi Valley AVA, covers land in 4 states and takes in about 29,900 square miles. That's about 77,000 square kilometers for viewers outside of the U.S. While the smallest one, Cole Ranch AVA in California's Mendocino County, clocks in at about 60 U.S. acres, or about 24 hectares. AVAs can also be layered on top of each other in much the same way that AOCs can in France, and since they're based on natural features of geography, they can cross political boundaries like state and county lines. Here's a stylized map of 3 AVAs in Washington and Oregon State. The largest of these, the Columbia Valley AVA, straddles the border between the 2 states and takes in, among others, the smaller AVAs of Walla Walla Valley and the Rocks District of Milton Freewater. Generally speaking, smaller sub-AVAs, as they're called, like Walla Walla and the Rocks, are considered more prestigious than larger AVAs like Columbia Valley, but not because they're more strictly regulated than larger AVAs. Going back to the concept of terroir, the idea is that the smaller an AVA is, the more prevalent the particular factors thought to improve grape quality will be. Though even in a small AVA like the Rocks, which is about 3,700 acres or 1,500 hectares in size, the defining features won't necessarily be present in all vineyards. Keep in mind, though, that unlike France or other EU countries, Wines don't have to qualify for the AVAs their grapes are from. They just have to be made from a certain percentage of grapes grown in an AVA to be designated as a wine from that AVA. So while a wine made from grapes grown in the Walla Walla Valley technically could be designated as a Columbia Valley AVA wine if the winery wanted it to be, there usually isn't a compelling reason to take the less prestigious designation. To be identified as a wine from a particular AVA, 85% of the grapes used to make that wine had to have been grown in the listed AVA. Oregon has a stricter standard here than other U.S. states, and it requires 95% of the grapes used for the wine to be from the AVA named on the bottle. For comparison, remember that at the PDO or quality level of the EU classification scheme, 100% of the grapes are required to come from the listed AOC, DO, DOC, or whatever the designation of the member country. And the general U.S. requirement of 85% is the same as the EU requirement for the PGI level wines, that is, wines made from the middle tier of the quality pyramid. Only 3/4 of a wine designated with a state or county name as opposed to an AVA needs to be made from grapes grown in the named area, though California or Oregon require 100% of the grapes to be from those states if the bottle says California or Oregon State. Washington requires 95% of the juice in the bottle to be from grapes grown in Washington if the word Washington is to be used on the bottle, and Texas has an 85% requirement for wines at the state level. With over 230 AVAs and new ones being added regularly, this system is a feature of American wine law that looks here to stay for a while. But like many things in the wine world, AVAs aren't without controversy, and all of the controversies surrounding this system seem to distill down to one particular question, which is what exactly does an AVA designation on a bottle tell a consumer who's thinking of buying that bottle? The answer is not very much. If you see an AVA listed on a bottle of wine, you can be pretty comfortable with the knowledge that, at a minimum, 85% of the grapes that went into making the wine were grown in that AVA. But that's really about it. Though the producer can choose to disclose this information if they want to, an AVA designation doesn't tell you what grapes are in the wine, what kind of wine growing and winemaking practices went into the wine, nor does it tell you if the wine was made within the same AVA. In Washington State, for example, though most of the grapes that become wine there are grown in the Columbia Valley AVA, or in one of its 11 sub-AVAs east of the Cascade Mountains, a significant chunk of those grapes are trucked west over the Cascades to be made into wine at production facilities in greater King County, Seattle, and elsewhere, all of which are in a different AVA, the Puget Sound AVA. If these wines receive an AVA designation, though, it'll be for the Columbia Valley or one of the sub-appellations, because the only thing at issue in this system is where the grapes are from. For comparison's sake, wines made in the EU member countries at either the PDO or PGI levels have to be produced in the same named region that the grapes came from. So an AOC Bordeaux wine, for example, not only must have all its grapes come from the Bordeaux AOC, but the winery or production facility where the wine is made must reside in that AOC. But in the U.S., the rule is that wine from grapes grown in an AVA can receive that designation as long as the wine is produced within the same state. This particular rule rubbed a number of producers in Washington State the wrong way when the Rocks District of Milton-Freewater AVA was created in 2015. One of the key features used in designating this AVA was soil type, specifically the presence of a large number of basalt cobblestones or galettes deposited in an alluvial fan of the Walla Walla River. These stones are similar to ones found in other wine regions like Châteauneuf-du-Pape in southern France, and they provide great drainage for the vines as well as absorbing heat during the day and re-radiating it to the vines at night to help with ripening. So at the request of a group of wine producers, the TTB created the AVA to indicate to consumers that wines made from grapes grown here could be expected to be special because of the unique terroir. So far, so good. The problem was that while a few Oregon producers were using grapes from the Rocks vineyards, most of the grapes were going just a few miles north across the state line into Washington and being made into wine at wineries in Walla Walla, leaving those wineries ineligible to use this AVA to designate their wines. But it is possible for producers in other parts of Oregon, as far afield as Portland and beyond, to buy grapes from those vineyards, truck them hundreds of miles, and, as long as they remained in the Beaver State, have the wines made from them designated as the Rocks District of Milton-Freewater AVA wines. But I digress. While the AVA system does have its critics, it has supporters as well, And they argue that America is still young as winemaking nations go, so trying to regulate what grapes may be grown in an area, as well as a host of other practices along the European model, would be misguided, and American winemakers need the freedom to explore and get to know their terroirs before we can adopt anything even close to as regulated a system as the EU has. For now, they argue, the AVA system does a good, if occasionally flawed, job of letting consumers know which wines come from areas that are likely to help the wine bring something special to the table. This is another one of those topics that deserves a long conversation, and probably a nice glass of wine to go with it. So, what on a bottle tells you that you're buying a wine with an AVA designation? Figuring that out is surprisingly tricky because, per U.S. wine law, giving a more specific appellation of origin than the country the wine is from is optional on American wine labels. Most American wine does provide an appellation more specific than country of origin, but it doesn't have to be accompanied by any specific nomenclature other than the name of the state, county, or AVA. As a general rule, if you see only the name of a U.S. state on a label, like California, Washington, or New York, then that wine has a state appellation. If you see a name followed by the word county, as in Sonoma County or Contra Costa County, then the wine has a county appellation. If you just see a place name like Napa Valley or Columbia Gorge or Dundee Hills without any additional verbiage, or maybe with just a word like appellation following it, then you're likely dealing with a wine from an AVA. Generally, you won't see the words American Viticultural Area or the letters AVA on a label. Some AVAs, like Napa Valley, are very well known, but others are more obscure. And if you have any doubts about whether the wine you're looking at is from an AVA or not, a little research online should clear it up pretty quickly. And to make that easier, I've included a link in the description to this video to a PDF of current AVAs that the TTB updates regularly. Here are some examples of appellations on wine labels so you can have a visual frame of reference. This bottle is identified as a California red wine, with no additional appellation. This is a state appellation, and it means, in this case, that 100% of the grapes were sourced from California, but they could have been sourced from anywhere in the state, including multiple sites. If you saw a parallel version of this label, but with Oregon swapped in for California, 100% of the grapes would also need to be from Oregon. If Washington were there instead, the percentage would go down to 95%, and then 85% if the state appellation were Texas. In all other cases of a state appellation, only 75% of the grapes need to be from that state. Here are 3 county-level appellations, all from California. Note the word county after each of the place names. In cases where only a single county is named, a minimum 75% of the grapes in that wine must come from that county. In cases where 2 or more counties are named, as in the third label, the producer needs to specify the exact percentages from each county. And here are 2 wines from AVAs. One from Red Mountain in Washington State and one from Napa Valley in California. Note that there are no additional words beyond the name of the AVA. So, at a minimum, 85% of the grapes in these wines had to be grown in their respective appellations. If one of these appellations had been in Oregon, then 95% of the grapes would have had to have been grown there. The appearance of the word Washington on the first wine means that a minimum of 95% of the grapes this wine was made from were grown somewhere in Washington State, though only 85% had to be grown in the named appellation. For something as unregulated as the AVA system is, we ended up covering a lot of information in this Winecast, so here are just a few things to remember as a consumer when it comes to AVAs. First, under the present system, an AVA on a label doesn't tell you any more about the wine than where at least a certain percentage of the grapes that wine was made from were grown. The producer may give you information about what grapes were used and how they were grown or made into wine, or he may not give you that information. But nothing about these things can be deduced by just looking at the name of an AVA. Second, the idea that grapes grown in different areas will have different characteristics is sound, so telling you about where the grapes come from is definitely a plus that the AVA system brings to the table. But statements about a grape's place of origin are most informative when they indicate a small, more homogeneous area. Basically, you're going to be able to deduce more about what characteristics a wine is likely to have if you know the grapes were sourced from the 4,000 acres of Red Mountain than if you only know they were sourced from somewhere in the 11 million acres of Columbia Valley. Finally, Though there are plenty of wine producers that avail themselves of state and county appellations so that they can source cheap grapes from all over the place, there's also plenty of bad wine coming out of AVAs. And finally, you should definitely not just assume that because a wine is made out of AVA, at least at the county level, that it's a lesser wine. This is a bottle of Chardonnay from one of my favorite Chard and Cabernet Sauvignon producers, and in my opinion, one of the best producers in California, Fisher Vineyards. They started out in 1973 before the AVA system was even developed, and the land they grew many of their grapes on wasn't in an AVA until a year ago with the creation of the new Fountain Grove District AVA in East Sonoma County. But for 4 decades, this winery produced example after example of excellent, age-worthy whites and reds, some of the first vintages of which are still drinking brilliantly today. Yeah, that original land is currently in an AVA, but since AVAs don't mandate anything about how they grow their grapes or make their wine, the only difference now is that they have a new fancy name they can put on the bottle if they choose to. Just something to think about. Thanks as always for joining me. Please like or subscribe if you found this cast helpful or otherwise enjoyed it, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments either way. I'm your host, the Unknown Winecaster, and I'm out. Enjoy the grape, but always enjoy it responsibly.